Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, October 26th, 2025, and today we're going to be talking about the state of New Hampshire, as Republicans across the state seem to ask the Republicans to ditch Scott Brown and embrace John Sununu in a Senate race that doesn't seem to be going too well for Republicans as they look for an opportunity to potentially push back against the Democrats on the national stage in one of these states that used to be more of a battleground. It finds itself leaning more towards the left in recent years that they think they might have a chance in for the upcoming midterms. Now, the reason why this is noteworthy is because Scott Brown is the Republican who has run for Senate before in the state of New Hampshire. And he was so bad, the Republicans turned to a senator who has not won an election since 2002. I'm dating myself a little bit, but that's the year I was born. Thinking about today, now I'm presenting these videos in front of you and to you, thinking about just how long ago that was. They had to pull a Sununu out of the woodworks, not the governor who had served across the state and has been a top recruit, but rather John Sununu, the brother of Chris Sununu, who they are looking to bring in to run for office, who served in the Senate from New Hampshire before, but only in the 2000s. And so thinking about why, we think Scott Brown in the first place, who was the first Republican to announce that he was running for Senate in New Hampshire, he might be a name that rings a bell, especially if you were watching the Obama-era politics closely. But in 2010, Scott Brown made a name for himself by being elected to the United States Senate, except, get this, not from the state of New Hampshire. In 2010, Scott Brown ran in a special election in January of 2010, at the height of the Tea Party movement and at a time where states like Massachusetts, which historically had been reliably for the Democratic Party, found themselves voting for Republicans. And in 2010, Scott Brown won his election against the incumbent attorney general in this seat by a margin here of roughly 4 points. It was a massive upset, and it was one that was really regarded as being quite interesting because the Republican Party was never supposed to win this race. In the final stretch of the campaign, yes, Scott Brown started to do much better, but genuinely speaking, it was completely out of left field that this race would go to the Republican Party. And so it did. In 2010, Scott Brown made history as a Republican from Massachusetts. But 2 years later, he would go on to beat, at the time, Elizabeth Warren, who was not elected to the Senate until 2012, who obviously, in, just 8 years' time before the 2020 election, made a big name for herself, given her politics and her outspokenness on the Senate floor. But it was until 2012 that Scott Brown lost to Elizabeth Warren. And 2 years later, he decided that he was going to run for Senate again. And instead of run for Senate in Massachusetts, he jumped over to the neighboring New Hampshire. And he lost his election when Republicans were winning all across the country by roughly 4 points. New Hampshire stood out to the Republicans, and that's because Scott Brown, not being from the state of New Hampshire, made a big difference. Republicans picked up West Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, Louisiana, Iowa, South Dakota, Montana, Colorado, Alaska. I mean, you were talking about them wiping the floor with the Democratic Party. Some of these seats that in 2008 Republicans didn't even throw into consideration, didn't even field a candidate, that were flipping in 2014. But yet New Hampshire wouldn't flip because Scott Brown was so bad on the GOP side that they practically gave up that race, and he was never going to be the right guy. He was a senator from Massachusetts. The slogan Republicans love to run on in New Hampshire and in surrounding states is "Don't Massachusetts my New Hampshire." Well, that's exactly what they were going to do. And it was largely ineffective on the Republican side to make that case to the voters in this state that said, wait a second, you're not even from New Hampshire. This is a state that cares very deeply about where candidates are from. And for better or for worse, it ended up hurting the Republican Party. And looking at 2014, it was a stain on the GOP's record in a seat that should have been 1,000% winnable. Well, fast forward to 2025, Scott Brown entered into this race and came into it, at the time, if Sununu had not announced that he was running, as the undeniable frontrunner. Exceptionally high name ID, he had run across the state before, and it seemed as if he was making his return to politics over a decade later to make that argument that I've been in New Hampshire and I know the people here now better and X, Y, and Z. But now Republicans really want him out, because if anyone's going to lose to Chris Pappas by 12 points, it's going to be Scott Brown. Because voters haven't changed their minds on him, and his campaign is largely a stain as well on the New Hampshire Republican Party today. Scandal after scandal coming out from his campaign, and voters are tired of his name. Sununu, on the other hand, it seems voters are welcoming in with open arms. Obviously not to the degree that you'd think, but certainly to some extent that they are looking at it and saying, okay, maybe he'd be a better option. because the general election polling says that, for instance, the numbers from coefficient, Chris Pappas leads Scott Brown by 10, but against John Sununu and the same electorate by 3. If there was any Republican who could make this race more competitive, it would be John Sununu. But Scott Brown doesn't seem like he's going anywhere. He wants to stay involved in this electoral politics. He wants to continue running for office in this state. And given the endorsement game here, well, Donald Trump hasn't spoken on the race, but John Sununu only has Tim Scott. Scott Brown, on the other hand, has Mike Pompeo. 2 allies of the president. It'd be interesting to see where this goes, because Scott Brown served in Donald Trump's administration, right? Scott Brown has been someone who knows this. And when you think about, the race before that predates this election in New Hampshire in 2014 that Scott Brown lost, John Sununu also lost to Jeanne Shaheen. He, in fact, lost by more in 2008. He lost by roughly 6 points. So Sununu has lost this exact Senate seat before. It'd be interesting to see if he really thinks that he can win it again. But in either case, the Republicans clearly have their minds made up, but the candidates just simply won't budge. This is a sign of a dysfunctional Republican Party. This is a sign of someone, of a political party that does not even have the political capital to move out a candidate that they desperately want out of the race. It's not lost on me that the conservative Washington Examiner has taken up this piece as one that Republicans only seem to be pitching to their outlets, because this is something that will get to the minds and ears of Republican primary voters in New Hampshire, and it's clear they're trying to move mountains here when Scott Brown just simply will not drop out. And it also is noteworthy, too, in and of itself, that New Hampshire Republicans are fighting a separate battle. Separately, as we've been talking about in the past week, the redistricting battle in the state has come to a close as Governor Kelly Ayotte has announced very clearly for months on end now that she is done with conversations around redistricting in the state, and the Republican who put forth the mid-decade redraw bill has withdrawn the bill from vote. Even though Republicans have an advantage in the state house of 2-1, not in the state Senate, rather, of 2-1, and an advantage of about 50 seats in the state house. New Hampshire, actually, shockingly enough, has over 400 seats, roughly around 400 in terms of their total delegation for state house. It really is laughable, because when you think about it, for every one electoral vote that they have 100 seats in their state house. There are less seats. There are more seats in the, let me say it this way. I'm losing my train of thought here, but the point is that there are, roughly about 9 or 10 times the amount of seats in the state house in New Hampshire as there are state Senate districts in Texas, right? So when you think about just how fascinating it is, New Hampshire has a huge body. Republicans dominate it, and yet they couldn't get it through because the governor said no. And now when it comes down to Senate candidates and trying to find the most viable one, it's very clear the answer has always been Sununu. I'm sure enough voters are also going to think that this John Sununu is, by extension, Chris Sununu. Obviously, I don't like to say and be reductionist in terms of thinking about voting trends, but oftentimes last names and political dynasties do better because voters recognize and trust the names. And for John Sununu, that's to his benefit. For Scott Brown, it's to his detriment. They remember Scott Brown as the carpetbagger from Massachusetts. They remember Scott Brown as the Republican who lost in a red wave. They remember these things. And given the current issues of the existing campaign, they are well within their rights to want Scott Brown out of the race. And they are well within their rights of wanting the New Hampshire GOP to really embrace John Sununu. But for as long as Scott Brown is in this race, I don't think the primary will be particularly competitive. I do think that, Scott Brown is going to lose this race. But at the end of the day, the longer he is in it, he forces the hand of the Republican Party to not make major concessions and endorsements in this race while simultaneously keeping this race not competitive, but one that John Sununu can't just pivot to the general election. Whereas on the Democratic side in a state, keep in mind, this is already, a Democratic state. Kamala Harris winning this state, I think, should be the story of it all, that in a blue midterm, Republicans are probably not winning Senate control through the state of New Hampshire. It will most certainly go elsewhere. But if 2014 was indicative of anything, the wrong type of candidate on the wave party side does not always exclude New Hampshire from voting for that opposition party or for that whichever party is doing well, right? And so I think in 2026, I don't think Democrats should treat it as if it's a done deal. But I think you're getting closer to about a 75-80% chance that Democrats are winning New Hampshire because Kamala Harris won it, Hillary Clinton won it, Joe Biden won it, Obama won it twice, even John Kerry won New Hampshire. Republicans haven't won it on the presidential level in over 20 years. And I doubt that, of all the blue waves that we've seen, New Hampshire, which has reliably gone to the Democratic Party in said blue waves, would break rank in 2026, especially if the GOP can't even get their act together in the lead up to the primary. But like I was saying on the Democratic side, Chris Pappas is fine. This race really is not competitive. He has the endorsement of both of the sitting senators, Maggie Hassan, Jeanne Shaheen. He has the endorsement of the former U.S. Rep from New Hampshire's 2nd District and the incumbent U.S. Rep, Maggie Goodlander, Annie Kuster across the state. He has a huge amount of endorsements in New Hampshire, and based on the data, is up at 65% in a preliminary poll from over a month ago. I can only imagine with the $4 million that he's raised and the $2 million that he's spent and this already big focus on the general election that it's already an assumed thing that Chris Pappas will be elected to the U.S. Senate, or not elected, but nominated on the Democratic side to represent them for the Democratic ticket come November of 2026. And so I think as we get closer to the general election, sure, John Sununu could make this race more competitive, but he needs to get through his primary first. And he needs Scott Brown out of the race sooner rather than later, otherwise he'll be caught up in a contentious and interesting Republican primary rather than anything else, rather than anything that would make, that would be more important, which to the Republicans would and should in fact be winning a general election. So what we know, what we understand, what we have come to realize is that New Hampshire in itself just simply has what seems to be a dysfunctional Republican Party. Whether it's being able to manage expectations and priorities of the governor's mansion, whether it's handling the top 2 contenders running for U.S. Senate in 2026, whether it's a Trump admin official who wants to run and primary the incumbent Republican, New Hampshire's GOP as a state party that has not won on the presidential level since 2000 with George W. Bush against Al Gore, it really does call into question about the effectiveness of their political party and how well they might do in 2026. And my honest take here is that if they can't even clear a primary field, which we already know what the politically expedient choice would be for their party, chances are they're not making many waves. Chances are they're not doing much for their party. And as we see it here across the board, whether it's a governor's race, a governor's primary, congressional redistricting, the Senate race, literally whatever it is, the Republican Party does not seem to be in a great position. They are not sending their best. And thinking about what the 26 midterms would look like in New Hampshire, I wouldn't be super solid and locked in on the Republican side if I was looking at it from that race, because it does seem like Democrats have the upper hand in more ways than one. And looking at the 26 cycle, if they can't even handle a primary, what makes you think that they can handle a general election in a Democratic wave year? So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.